Hello, and welcome to Black Box Online Radio. I hope you will enjoy our discussion about the Zodiac Killer and some of the psychological profiling techniques that people use when they're discussing the case. It is a direct response to Dr. Todd Grande's channel and the assessment that he made of the Zodiac Killer. We use him as sort of a reference point from time to time, especially when we looked at the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And we've also talked about Zodiac psychology in the past, such as our upload, Z Psychology. I would hope that you guys would check out some of those in the future. But right now, I would like to just make the announcement that the documentary Obsession into Darkness is now back up on YouTube. And at the end of this video, if you'd like to check it out, there's a link in the description box here, narrated by yours truly here on Black Box Online Radio. So, without further ado, let's play today's episode. And once again, if you'd like, please check out our documentary on Obsession into Darkness on the Zodiac Killer channel. Link in the description box. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. And as always, if you like this upload, you can hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, at the end, please drop some comments below so we can continue the discussion. And this show now has an Instagram page, BlackBoxNed88. One more time, BlackBoxNed88. And if you follow the show on Instagram, you'll get access to a special bonus podcast talking about music, movies, daily life, and more. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. Well, I was actually planning on doing something completely different today, but I saw that there was this video that had been uploaded to Dr. Todd Grande's YouTube channel talking about the psychological profile of the Zodiac Killer. And I couldn't resist that. So I thought we would mention some of the things that he talked about in his video and have a discussion about it, because this is one of the things with the Zodiac Killer that I think is perhaps the most fascinating, and because it's so abstract. Abstract at first in the social science sense, and the secondary point with that is just we don't know everything about even who all the people in the Zodiac Killer mystery were. And even if you haven't heard Dr. Todd Grande's video, which is only about 26 minutes long, it's available on his channel. Dr. Todd Grande is the name of the channel too, here on YouTube. Even if you haven't heard that video, you can still just keep listening, because we're just talking about the Zodiac Killer and some things that are going on with the mystery, if you will. Now, the first thing to say is he definitely wanted to zone in on a particular word, narcissism. He's talking about it's possible that the Zodiac Killer even had narcissistic personality disorder, but just really trying to identify that this was somebody who was very narcissistic, but also very low in neuroticism. And I thought that was also interesting, because as a psychologist, Dr. Todd Grande made an observation that I wouldn't really think about too much, because I am not a psychologist, very open about that. He's saying that the Zodiac Killer was somebody who was very low in neuroticism, but also very insecure. So you have someone who's very calm, doesn't really worry about too many things, but still very insecure. And that was one of the things that I heard. I thought that was a very surprising statement. Other than that, I thought that it was rather similar to Sharon Hagen's psychological profile that she put forward, saying that this was not a group of people. This was one man who had stable employment, who operated on nights and weekends, and that Todd Grande added in a few things. It's possible in his research for the video that he encountered Sharon Hagen's psychological profile. I would expect that he would have, and perhaps he agreed with it. But he added in one very interesting thing to this. When he said that it's most likely that the Zodiac Killer was someone who had a job that was very solitary, like he would work with stable employment, but work by himself most of the time. And there's a big line from Thomas Henry Horne, who's also the author of The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 and 69 and that series of books, when he says, of course, that first and foremost, we're not dealing with one person, but we're dealing with a group of people. And the way that he comes about with this particular issue is that he says that Robert Graysmith, with his book, Zodiac, from 1986, completely altered the course of Zodiac perceptions. Like, everybody who is going to be looking at the perceptions of the Zodiac Killer, trying to analyze the psychological profile. They are not going to be analyzing the actual Zodiac Killer or the group of people that were involved with this. Instead, they are going to be looking at this fictional persona that Robert Graysmith has created. On the one hand, I could definitely tell that Dr. Todd Grande was discussing some material from Robert Graysmith. I can definitely tell he's using some things from Robert Graysmith's narrative, and we even did a book discussion on Zodiac Unmasked here on this channel, so, I mean, if you've read the book, you can definitely tell that that's the source material that he would be using, and it's not necessarily that he would have read the book himself, but it has been shared by many, many, many different media outlets. Robert Graysmith does become somewhat of a classic source that people will use when they're talking about the Zodiac Killer. However, one point where I completely disagree with Thomas Henry Horne is that Graysmith isn't the only source for this stuff. I mean, people were also looking into this stuff even back to 1969, and a classic example of this is the 1971 film The Zodiac Killer. Zodiac was in 2007, the David Fincher film. The Zodiac Killer was the name of the movie. It's actually available here on YouTube for free. At the time of this recording, it's still online. You can see the full movie, The Zodiac Killer from 1971. And the way that Todd Grande was describing the Zodiac Killer in terms of a psychological profile was actually much more in line with the 1971 film and the way that they created, their presentation on the Zodiac Killer, and compared to that of Robert Graysmith, because you have someone who is very solitary, very calm, I guess you'd say low in neuroticism, because that film really tries to tie it into the occult rituals, and that there is somebody who is genuinely believing that he can communicate with souls and he can collect slaves for the afterlife. And we do find that, right, in the 408 cipher, that the Zodiac clearly says, I like killing people because it is so much fun. I want to collect slaves for my afterlife. I will die and I will be reborn in paradise and they will be my slaves. All of that stuff. One point that was mentioned by Dr. Todd Grande that I thought was really interesting was that shows that there are two possibilities. Number one, either the Zodiac Killer was delusional, or number two, he wanted the police to think that he was delusional, when in reality, it's just another layer of deception. I'd say, though, I mean, my biggest kind of response is that, like, when I'm listening to a psychologist talk about the Zodiac Killer, is not a single mention of it was this the work of multiple perpetrators. No, not even entertaining the group murder theory, the hoax theory. Immediately, well, just looking at the possibility of this being one person and not even asking the question, could more than one person have been involved? Now, when we want to examine it in that particular way, I mean, I think that they should definitely be asking that question. But a lot of the reasons why I began to notice that, or at least go down the group murder theory pathway and even explore it, even exploring the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, like we read the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 on this channel. We did a 17-part discussion on that one. And the reason why is you look at all of these differences. Like, first and foremost, Lake Herman Road happened in the winter. Then you have Blue Rock Springs happening on the 4th of July. Then at Lake Berryessa, the killer is wearing a hood and using a knife instead of a handgun. Even though he had a handgun on him, he chose to stab the victims. And then, with the Paul Stine murder of Presidio Heights, a woman isn't even present, and a man is killed by himself, Paul Stine. So the thing is, it's like, what about all of these differences? And as a psychologist, Todd Grande had some interesting things to say about why are there all of these differences and inconsistencies. Number one, he really looked into the possibility that the Zodiac Killer was someone who was sexually motivated, something that I've disputed a lot, but he's the psychologist and I'm not. He says that the Zodiac was sexually motivated, even though he was targeting couples, and that's like the whole lover's lane, jealousy angle. And he also cited David Berkowitz as an example of someone who would have done that for sexual means, but not done in the exact same way as other sexual predators. But the other thing to say about that is, when it comes to Lake Berryessa, as we said, committing a murder in the daytime as opposed to night, wearing the hood when he didn't wear the hood in the previous two incidents, using a knife when he used only the handgun in the previous two incidents. Why? It was to show the police that he had a new level of criminal versatility. But one of the other points that was mentioned by Todd Grande in the beginning is the Zodiac Killer was someone who did indeed have an animosity for women. We've been wrestling with that question for ages here on this channel. But the thing is, though, it's like, you got to ask yourself, well, then what about all these male victims? What about Paul Stine? I mean, like I said that out loud when I'm watching the video. Paul Stine was murdered. The taxi driver killed on October 11th of 1969 by himself. No women were present. What does that have to do with animosity toward women as being a motivating factor? What Todd Grande said was, the Zodiac was someone who wanted to taunt the police, to troll the police. He was someone, as we said, narcissistic, but at the same time also very insecure. And so it's like, or just needing the constant reaffirmation, the constant benefit, the constant appraisal and reward, and just someone who always needed to be validated and just needed the constant recognition for being someone who is very intelligent. But so then that's what he's saying all of these differences mean. Someone was trying to show criminal versatility. That's number one. Someone was trying to show that they are more intelligent than other people. Number two. And the third thing is to confuse the police. So you have three different couples that were attacked. I was about to say lovers' lanes, but I think that there's some debate about whether Lake Herman Road was a genuine lover's lane or not, and it's possible that on the night that Mike Mageau and Darlene Ferrin were attacked, that they might not have been doing anything related to actually being in love and actually being a couple. Many people think that they only went to Blue Rock Springs Park that night to buy drugs, and that they were just sharing a ride. Whether or not Darlene Ferrin did something with Mike Mageau in the past, maybe she was known to have affairs, and it's possible she was having affairs with 6 different police officers during the course of her marriages. So, but we can digress from that right now. The big thing to say is, the Zodiac was trying to show criminal versatility and to confuse the police. Yes, women may have started as a motivating factor, but then he murdered Paul Stine simply to add in another confusing element. Now the police aren't going to be able to make sense of this, and Gareth Penn surprisingly talked about, oh no, I'm not Gareth Penn, Todd Grande talked about Gareth Penn's radiant theory in this and identified Gareth Penn by name. And what he was saying is that you put the radians on top of Mount Diablo, and then it matches up to Blue Rock Springs Park and to Presidio Heights, although it might actually be going to Blue Rock Springs Golf Course, but in the Blue Rock Springs area. So then the thing to say about that is, what you would really want to look for is that someone is trying to show that they know more than the people who are trying to stop him. What I can say, though, is I think that the discussions, though, about the group murder theory and the hoax theory really caught my eye for a particular issue. And to kind of go off on a side note here, somebody was leaving something in one of the comments sections on a previous Zodiac Killer video saying that I do not commit to any single theory. And I think it's a good time to talk about it right now, because in the past, when I first learned about the suspect, Louis Myers, I had that aha moment, and I began to think that he was the genuine, well, the Zodiac Killer. Like, that's the issue, though. Louis Myers would have been 17 at the time of the first murder, and I just began to really think that he was the most credible suspect, and that's why the police never caught him, because they were not looking for a teenager. They were looking for somebody much older. But, of course, some new evidence came out, and we've learned a little bit more about the Zodiac Killer since 2017, so I drifted away from Louis Myers as a suspect. And in 2019, I was really going down this group murder pathway, and I hadn't learned about Thomas Henry Horne yet in the Great Zodiac Killer hoax, but that was very similar to the group murder theory. But the way that I began to imagine the group murder theory is more of a thrill kill club as opposed to a hoax where you have the people in the narcotics division of the SFPD manipulating some things, particularly Hal Snook, but of course other people would have been involved with it. And then by September of 1969, the Zodiac Killer would have taken on a life of its own. There are many sides of the hoax theory, but no, for a while I was really insistent that this was a thrill kill club, that variant of the group theory, that there were a group of men that planned this together, and each person was going to commit a different murder, and that's why you would have all of these differences, because it is abnormal for a perpetrator to switch from shooting victims at night to stabbing them during the day. Very abnormal indeed, once you compare it across many other true crime cases. And you even have somebody like Michael Butterfield saying the Zodiac didn't need to do that because he wasn't a sexually motivated serial killer. Todd Grande really countered that and said that, yes, he does believe that these crimes are sexually motivated, even though the victims weren't molested, but because men and women were together and they were attacked on lovers' lanes or in secluded areas, then there is a sexual component. And he also said something that was rather consistent with Gary Stewart's analysis of this. I really do not speak highly of Gary Stewart and his book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, which we talked about on this channel. But what Gary Stewart said was, the Zodiac Killer was attacking the women at these lovers' lanes, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Lake Berryessa. He didn't necessarily care about the men. They were just an obstacle that was in the way of killing the women. And you will find that also very frequently discussed in serial killer literature. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, we always come back to them, the Boneyard Killers. That is very clearly discussed. That is one of the clearest examples of how people are killing outside of their own sexual orientation, simply because the other genders and the way men are in the way, they want to get rid of the men so they can have access to the women. And I haven't done a single upload on him, but we did mention the case of Israel Keys the other day, and he was someone that I just heard about on 48 Hours, but he did the exact same thing. It's like he attacked both men and women, but he was killing men so he could have access to the women. It happens very frequently in serial killer literature that somebody would do something like that. And is it possible then that someone just says that I'm going to murder Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969 to confuse the heck out of the police? It's possible, but what I would have to say is that based on a lot of the narrative that Todd Grande was using in his video, he is definitely using some things that I wouldn't want to say necessarily that have been disproven, but rather that he is using Robert Graysmith's narrative for a lot of these things. And if you read The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, it shows that Graysmith allegedly fabricated certain pieces of information in the book. I mean, we're talking down to the sentence, like taking a sentence that is half true and adding a fictitious ending. So everything you're reading in Zodiac from 1986 is half true and half false. But I'd say that the biggest takeaways that I had from this were that the Zodiac was intentionally trying to be confusing. It's possible that the Zodiac Killer was not delusional at all. And by the Zodiac, let's really focus in on the person writing the letters is not delusional, but maybe he wanted the police to think that he was delusional. And another point, though, is that we were talking about Lawrence Kane on his timeline of events the other day, and someone left an insightful comment about how Lawrence Kane was somebody who got arrested numerous times for shoplifting. And if he can't pull off shoplifting, how on earth could he be the Zodiac Killer? If he couldn't even get away with that small crime, how would he get away with these 5 flawless murders? And Todd Grande did address that. He says that he believes that the Zodiac Killer most likely had a big history of being arrested for smaller events throughout his lifetime. I don't really know, though, like how somebody like Hal Snook would fit into that if you're going to look at Thomas Horton's theory. But, I mean, even people like Richard Gaikowski have been arrested, although that may have been somewhat of a hoax on Gaikowski's part. Arthur Lee Allen definitely arrested for multiple things and served jail time for, well, his actions with children. But the thing that I'd say the biggest takeaway, though, is when you look at the Zodiac as a person, and I mean, well, actually, there's a big thing that I would actually like to say instead, and it's the word Machiavellian. Because after I watched Todd Grande's video on Machiavellianism, like someone who thinks that they are so intelligent that they can live by their own rules and they can sort of weave around the barriers of society because they believe that they're too smart to follow the laws of other people, instantly, I thought that that's the Zodiac Killer. But I guess to the point that I was going to say just then, the big takeaway was that the Zodiac is somebody who matches up with half the suspects. Half the people that you look at as suspects will match the psychological profile. Narcissistic, Machiavellian, possibly psychopathic, but I'm still not convinced that the Zodiac is psychopathic, and especially not if you get into the group murder theory, or the hoax theory. Then you're really not dealing with someone who is psychopathic. Rather, instead, you're dealing with someone who is, well, they are trying to outsmart people, and they are, perhaps, there really is something to that. Someone who is low in neuroticism, who isn't worrying a lot, someone who has a high IQ, but at the same time, they have that kind of low self-worth, or they just need the constant reaffirmations. They need constant praise and recognition to kind of get that sort of, to deal with that level of insecurity. But I was really surprised how closely Todd Grande's psychological profile matches the depiction of the Zodiac Killer in the 1971 film. Well, that's all that we have to say about this one. If you have anything to say at all, please drop some comments below. I would love to hear from you. And, I'm not a psychologist. I just think that sometimes it's good to have outside-the-box thinking in these things. If you have anything you'd like to share about the Zodiac Killer and the psychological profile of the Zodiac, please drop some comments below. And I also would just leave you with one particular line, maybe the best line in the whole video, actually, is when Dr. Todd Grande is talking about how the Zodiac Killer was someone who was a murderer, but here we see our first look at the Zodiac Killer's ability to murder grammar. That's what he did in the letters that he wrote. He didn't have any respect for the rules of grammar. And all we got to say about that is those misspellings might be intentional, the grammatical things might be intentional as well, but sometimes those letters are hard to read. Well, that's all for me now, and I will see you guys on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.